Well, hello. So glad we get the opportunity to conclude our study of the book of Ruth, getting into Ruth chapter 4. The climax of the book, we're going to get a chance to talk about the really exciting conclusion, but also what the book of Ruth means to us as a cohesive whole. What is its place in the overall story of the Bible? Really excited to have Trey Haskett from Tupelo, Mississippi, and Greg Kline from Birmingham, Alabama with us again. Been a really good study with both these guys. Been very appreciative of their hard work in preparing all these things for us. So we're going to go ahead and dive right into Ruth chapter 4. We concluded chapter 3 with this kind of agreement between Ruth and Boaz that Boaz was going to redeem Ruth and Naomi. But there is a little bit of an unexpected problem, and that is that there is this closer relative that has to be addressed first, that has the right of redemption first. And this really kind of sets us up for what's going to occur in Ruth chapter 4, where Boaz is going to begin by having a conversation with this close relative who's never named, and we're going to bring that up in just a second. But we need to first kind of explain what exactly is going on here. Why is this Boaz's job, or why is this closer relative's job to redeem Naomi and Ruth? And so if we go into chapter 4 and verse 1, we'll go ahead and set the scene here. It says in verse 1 that now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the close relative of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So he said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. He took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. So what Boaz has done in kind of modern parlance is he's almost called kind of a legal council together. And so the gate of the city is where you conducted business. And this is where you made sure that things were made official. And then he kind of calls witnesses here with these 10 elders. And so he's making this very official. This is not Boaz just having a casual conversation with this close relative. He's kind of initiating an official legal business proceeding to deal with this issue. And so he's brought all of these people together to make sure that this is taken care of properly. We're again seeing Boaz as a very concerned man. He's a very diligent man. He wants to make sure that this is done right. So he gathers all these people together, and he said to the closest relative, Naomi, who has come back from the land of Moab, has to sell the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. So I thought to inform you, saying, buy it before those who are sitting here and before the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am after you. And he said, I will redeem it. So in order to understand what's going on here, turn over real quick, if you've got your Bible with you, to Leviticus chapter 25. And this kind of introduces us to this idea of redeeming property. Now, remember, Elimelech, who is Naomi's deceased husband, had left the land because there was a famine. He had gone to Moab, and he and his 2 sons die there. So when they come back, they theoretically have this parcel of land that is a part of their inheritance that all of Israel had gained through the conquest. But clearly, Ruth and Naomi do not have a way of supporting themselves through this land. So it's possible the land has just laid fallow. It's not been taken care of in the in-between period of time, or it's possible they just don't have the capacity to take care of it, but they need to sell it. They need to sell it in order to provide for themselves now that the barley and wheat harvest has concluded. Well, in Leviticus chapter 25 and verse 23, Moses writes that the land, moreover, shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine, for you are but aliens and sojourners with me. Thus, for every piece of your property, you are to provide for the redemption of the land. If a fellow countryman of yours becomes so poor he has to sell part of his property, then his nearest kinsman is to come and buy back what his relative has sold. Or in case a man has no kinsman, but so recovers his mean as to find sufficient for his redemption, he shall calculate the years since his sale and refund the balance to the man to whom he sold it, and so return to his property. If he has not found sufficient means to get it back for himself, then what he has sold shall remain in the hands of its purchaser until the year of Jubilee, but at the Jubilee it shall revert that he may return to his property. So that's a lot of dense legal language to basically say that God has given the land of Canaan to the tribes of Israel as a blessing. And he doesn't want them just parceling this out and selling this and forsaking their inheritance because they've become too poor to support themselves. And so what he has set up is a system in which if you have become too poor to support yourself, too poor to use this land, you are to sell it to a close relative, someone of a similar tribe, of a similar family, with the objective that you would then be able to return to that land either when you are able to pay it back or during that year of Jubilee where all debts are forgiven. The purpose of this means that basically nobody ever permanently loses their inheritance, because that's a crucial part of the promises made by God to Israel, is that every man would have his inheritance in the promised land. So that's what's going on here, is that Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion, who have all died, are unable to do this. They're unable to provide for their family. And so Naomi and Ruth, these remnants of that family, aren't able to do this anymore. And so now it's the job by this law of their close relative to redeem this, to purchase the land, and then they're able to eventually, hopefully, either buy it back or in the year of Jubilee, it would revert back to these people. But there's an issue here, because it's not just about the land, it's also going to include a necessity of marriage. And that gets us into a whole different issue, which I'm going to turn over to Trey. So we have initially the close relatives like, great, I'll redeem the land, I'll take it. But then in verse 5, Boaz is going to introduce another part, and that's going to be Ruth herself. So Trey, talk to us a little bit about what's going on here in verse 5 with this marriage proposal here.
Absolutely. And when we think about this, and you mentioned this close relative and the responsibility that he would have had to redeem this land so that it stays in the family, he can take care of it so he can ultimately turn it back over to the family later. But he's going to get some benefit from that. That's going to provide for him for at least a good while. He's going to have some financial and economic benefit from this. And so this would be something that would have been appealing for him to buy this land back. It's interesting, he's called this redeemer or this close relative, however that word is translated, that we find throughout this text multiple times. And as we think about the family and the commitment that he would have had to continue the line of this family and continue to hold this land for this family, it's interesting. He's not ever given a name in this text. He's just called this redeemer here. That's what the narrator calls him time and time again. But you know what Boaz calls him? He says, turn aside, and the ESV says friend, and that's pretty unfortunate, that translation, because really in Hebrew, it's just so-and-so. Like, he's not even given a name in this text. And I don't know if you remember, those of you who are tuning in with us, I don't know if you remember several weeks ago as we introduced this series and began talking about it, we talked about the importance of all of these names. And now this guy doesn't even get a name. He's not going to be named in this text. And I think we're going to see why as we get into verse 5. And so that was a long way to get here. But verse 5 says, then Boaz says, the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. And so there's this other element here as well. It's not just the land that's involved here, but there's also this family that's tied to the land, Ruth the Moabite and her mother-in-law, Naomi, that are now going to become the responsibility of this no-named person, this no-named individual. And so he's all for it when it looks like he's going to get some economic gain, when he's going to get some financial gain. But when he hears that he's going to have to support two widows now, marry one of them and support another, then he starts to change his tune a little bit. And not only is he just going to have to take on the financial burden of supporting these two women, but he doesn't even get to keep the land, because the land doesn't belong to him. It belongs to Ruth's child, who is going to continue on the line of Mahlon and Chilion and their father Elimelech. And so it would never even be his. And so you see verse 5, after Boaz tells him that he's going to have to acquire Ruth as well, he says, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take the right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. And so he's worried about what's going to happen to him and to his family, his lineage, whether or not he's going to be able to provide for his sons on down the road. And he says, look, if I'm taking on this financial burden and I'm not gaining the benefit I thought I was getting from it, it's not worth it for me. And so now we can come to see maybe why, again, the importance of family being in the forefront of our minds, why this guy doesn't have a name. He's just so-and-so in this text, because he is not stepping up to the plate. He's not doing an honorable thing. Whereas what we're going to see, and I think Greg's going to get us into this a little bit as we get to verse 7, is Boaz acts very differently and has a very different outlook on his finances, on his wealth, and what he's willing to do with them for the sake of others. So, Greg, I'll toss that over to you and let you pick up there.
Yeah, I think that's one of the keys, that you might have some sympathy for Mr. No Name over here. You might say, well, I don't know that I'd want to take up all of this loss of a property. I'm going to spend all this money to redeem it up into the year of Jubilee, to its value. Not going to keep it permanently. Going to have a son by a different man. My life is fine the way it is. If you notice his response in verse 6, I cannot redeem it for myself lest I impair my own inheritance. And even if you wanted to look at this through rose-colored glasses, you'd say, okay, well, maybe he didn't need to do this, and so he's not stepping up. The problem is, the fly in that ointment is Boaz is awesome. Boaz comes up to the plate, and he's willing to be selfless at every turn. When Ruth isn't his, he's watching out for her. When Ruth is working hard in the field, he's making sure that she has enough of what she needs. Boaz, every step of the way, loves in a similar way to the way God loves. Mr. No Name loves the way Israelites loved, which is to say, selfishly at best, shirking responsibility at worst. So the best case scenario for him is he's kind of neutral and not very nice. The reality is, when contrasted with Boaz, he falls well short. That goes back to one of our themes throughout this book of Ruth is, how does God love? What do we need? And how does God look at the Israelites and the Moabites and other people? Does he just love the Israelites? Well, no, he actually cares a great deal. We're going to see at the end of this chapter how much God cares for Ruth, for Moabite people, for all peoples. And yet when we refuse to show that love to others, we find ourselves like Mr. No Name. In fact, God has it worse. When we disobey him, there are names for us, and it leads to us being eternally condemned. That's not worth it. So in verse 7, though, there's an interesting phrasing. It helps us with a couple things in Ruth. Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. Now, remember, what are they attesting? Boaz says to Mr. No Name, hey, that's why it's super catchy to say over and over, by the way, that you're not going to get, and that's not good. And so you keep going on that, and you think, well, I'm out. As he says in verse 6, I can't do that. So in verse 7, in front of the witnesses, here is Boaz saying, okay, we are making this deal. He has passed on his right of redemption, and now I can step up. Verse 8, so when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. So as we look at that, what we really need to see is that there are witnesses to this event. And also in verse 7, let's talk about this phrasing. Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel. That's a really weird way to write about current events. It'd be very strange for me to say, hey, we're going to go, and just like we used to do, we shook hands and we're going to shake hands. Like, no, we shake hands. Now, I'm aware that this is 2020 and a lot of us don't shake hands, but you know what I mean, and I should get credit for trying. Don't no name me. Right? So in verse 7 through 10, though, you have this official transaction happening. And so in verse 10, also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. Now, let's kind of finish on one thought here before I turn over to Andrew about this family lineage that is so important. Two thoughts. Let's put Boaz in his place and that he is fulfilling God's law. God cares about people. He cared about their families. He cared about their needs. This was part of God's law. Boaz didn't just invent this. Boaz isn't just some utilitarian who walks around and says, hey, I need to help somebody, so I'm going to help them. There is some law backing this. God cares for people. And so we need to care for people. And so then as we look, though, at also verse 10, notice what he does that Mr. No Name does not. I have bought to be my wife to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Boaz isn't just caring for Ruth here. Yes, that's it. That's obvious. He's not just caring for Naomi here. Yes, that is present. But what is also true is he is showing an appreciation for, a respect and love, if you will, for Mahlon as well. He's going to perpetuate someone else's name, that this may or may not be financially advantageous for him. By the way, it turns out God happens to bless those who are a blessing to others. That's a New Testament and Old Testament idea. But here is Boaz acting selflessly. And so I have to ask myself, do I love like this? To where I'm going to do something that's the right thing to do because God deserves me doing the right thing and because others need that help. That's what God does. The question is, do I love like that? Andrew, you talk about this family, though, that Boaz is going to have, but also notice even what the people say, how they are really rooting for Boaz and Ruth in a sort here, and their blessing they ascribe to him in 11 and 12.
Yeah, this blessing is a really interesting translation, or it's a really interesting transition, excuse me, because you get this these elders speaking, and it's almost as if No Name just completely fades to the background. It's like, okay, you have lost being even part of a story, and it's, you know, there's an irony to it because Boaz gives him the chance. He says you can acquire Ruth the Moabitess, which should be, as we've been seeing from Ruth's character, I mean, that's like hitting the jackpot. She is the Proverbs 31 woman that we've been looking at, that we've been talking about. Just an incredible woman who is godly, who is faithful, and you can raise up the name of the deceased. You can do what you've been looking to do. You can follow the law. And yet he says, no, that's too much. I don't want to do that. And so because he won't raise the name of the deceased, because he won't remember the name of the dead, he's completely forgotten. His name is not even recorded in the story for us. And so it's, you know, it's again one of these ironic twists. But as he fades to the background and Boaz comes into prominence in the story, that it says in verse 11 that all the people who were in the court and the elders, so not just the official witnesses, but all the people who were watching this, and again, it's in the city gates. I mean, you people would see this and start to kind of watch and try to figure out what's going on. They said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the women who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel. So fairly typical blessing. Rachel and Leah are, you know, the two female progenitors of these tribes, and they're through them and through their concubines. That's where the Israelite lineage starts. So that's to be expected. Both of whom built the house of Israel. And may you achieve wealth in Ephrathah and become famous in Bethlehem. And so in other words, may you now, in our little town, in our little section of it, may you become wealthy. May you be blessed in this little section. And then it says, moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman. This is a weirder story to reference because if you remember back to Genesis chapter 38, one of the most uncomfortable passages in the whole of the book of Genesis, you have this very odd story of Judah, who we know is an important character in the overall story of the Bible, because that's the tribe of Israel that David's going to come from. That's the tribe that the kings are going to come through. That's the tribe that the messianic promise is going to come through. And all of that's being foreshadowed in Genesis. Well, in the middle of a story supposedly about Joseph, all of a sudden the scene totally shifts to Judah and his family. And it's really kind of a train wreck of a story because Judah's oldest son is killed for being wicked. And it's just, you know, a terrible person. God strikes him down. Well, he leaves a widow by the name of Tamar. And so by this idea of this kind of similar principles we're seeing here of the idea of a levirate marriage, of the idea of continuing your relative's lineage, there's a second son, Onan, who's told, hey, you need to go and you need to marry Tamar and you need to have a son in your brother's name. Well, like this no-name guy, Onan doesn't want to do that. He's like, I don't want to have a son that's not going to be mine. And so he doesn't fulfill his obligation and he's struck dead. And so all of this is a very weird story to be referencing because what ends up happening is that Judah gets deceived by Tamar, who ends up dressing as a prostitute who lures him on the road. And there ends up being a son, two sons actually, by Judah and Tamar. And that's where the lineage of David and of the kings and the messianic promises starts to take off. And in some capacities, that's a really weird blessing to offer, that may this kind of shameful story be a replicate of your story. But we actually see really clear parallels here because Tamar is actually affirmed by Judah to be more righteous than Judah. That Judah's like, hey, she was trying to do better than I was. She was trying to preserve the lineage. I didn't give her my third son like I was supposed to. I didn't do the righteous thing. This woman actually is doing better than I was in this kind of messed up story. And so there is, I think, a very similar situation here of this Gentile woman, this non-Israelite woman, is being held up as righteous, is being held up as, in fact, even more righteous than the dead sons of Elimelech, who had not been righteous, who had not stayed in the promise, who had not been faithful to God's covenant. And so you're seeing, I think, the author of this story is intentionally drawing us to this idea that, yeah, this is a weird story. This is a story that we wouldn't expect out of an Israelite corner of the world. And yet God is working through this faithful Gentile to bring about something that, as we're going to see in the conclusion of the story, matters a whole lot to the overall biblical perspective. And it's interesting that then as we get into the next verse, we'll transition, it says that Boaz took Ruth, full stop. It's not Ruth the Moabite, it's not Ruth the Moabitess, it's not Ruth the foreigner, it's Ruth. And it's almost as if through this act of redemption that Boaz has not just redeemed Naomi and Ruth, but that he's brought Ruth into that covenant relationship. Ruth has been brought into that Israelite lineage, and she's become part of this greater story that stretches all the way back to Judah and Tamar, that stretches all the way back to Jacob and Rachel and Leah, that she's been grafted in to this story. And that's going to be really important for our overall perspective here. And so, Trey, as we're getting into kind of the conclusion here, we're now going to start to get not just Ruth and Boaz's story, but now this next generation's story. So what do you see in these next couple of verses here?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I just want to start by reading in verse 13. If y'all read along with me, it says, "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son." I want to stop there because there's something here that I think is really important in this story, something we've already mentioned, and that is God has been sort of working in the background a lot of times. Really, this is the only action that's actually attributed to him by the narrator. And so other people have suggested, okay, well, God do this. They're asking for blessings upon people, so may the Lord do this, and hoping that God will do something. Earlier in the story, Naomi heard that God had done something, and so he had caused the land to come out of the famine and be fruitful again. But here is the only verb that's actually attributed to God, where he is working in the story. And what is he doing? But providing for this family, giving her conception, allowing her to bear this son. And so even though God has sort of been in the background in a lot of this, just like what we find in the book of Esther, maybe not quite as explicit or implicit really there, he's working here, and this is what is attributed to him. He's the one who gives life. And that's what he's doing. He's giving life not only in the womb of Ruth, but also to Naomi, and in this story, and reversing her situation. And wherever we find Naomi, and however we come down as far as who she is as a character, what we can say is that God is the God of reversal. And so we see that here as we get into this next verse, as we have the voice of the women. And so we've heard from the no-name person, we've heard from all the people as they gather together, and the elders, and now this cacophony, it continues with the women as they give their voice and comment on this, and they say, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel." And so again, they're attributing this to God. This is God who is doing this. And he is the one who is blessed. He's the one who reverses your situation. You who left this land because you didn't have any food and came back empty because your husbands had died, and you had so little regard for what you had, God has completely reversed your situation. He's given you this Redeemer. It goes on to say, "He shall be to you restorer of life." And again, God is working through these means to restore life, "and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more than you, or more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." And so, again, the voice of these women as they're praising God through what he's done, you notice, and this is probably one of my big takeaways from the book, you notice that he's doing it sort of through these ordinary means. He's bringing about extraordinary results through these ordinary means, through this daughter who has married this man, and now they're bringing about this child, and this child gives life to Naomi in her old age. God is reversing this situation. But you'll notice also what they ascribe to Ruth: she is more to you than 7 sons. And I think that is very important to see here at the end, as these women note the worth of Ruth to Naomi. Because you remember, as Naomi comes back into the land, she's, "Don't call me Naomi," which means pleasant. "Call me Mara," which means bitter, because the Lord has dealt very bitterly with me, and I have gone away full, now I've come back empty. Oh yeah, I've got the daughter-in-law who's followed me back, and who's clung to me, and who's done everything that she could for me, but I'm empty, I don't have anything. And what these women affirm is, look, Ruth has been more than 7 sons to you. She has been everything for you. And of course, that number 7, carrying in that idea of completeness or fullness. And Ruth has been even more than that. And so Naomi takes the child, puts her on his lap, becomes her nurse, and the woman of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been given to Naomi, or born to Naomi, and they called him Obed, which means servant, or something similar to servant. It's what it sounds like anyway. And he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Greg, I left some on there for you, and I'll leave off there if you want to pick up and finish us out.
Sure. I think one of the things that stands out here is, like you said, God using ordinary means. But notice God's compassion in this section. Naomi's not by any sense a hero in the story. There's really no way to read it that way. Boaz is a hero. Ruth acts as a hero in many ways. But the compassion God has to take the lowly and the despised in a culture and to give them the greatest glory and majesty is amazing. To see what God has done in just what we have as 4 chapters, a few Bible page turns. Here's Ruth without really anything or anyone other than Naomi, who comes across in chapter 1 as the worst. You know, when you hear someone, you're like, that's the worst. That's Naomi. You have Mr. No Name and Naomi. They would have been a good pair. Ruth did not deserve to be stuck with Mr. No Name. Maybe Naomi did. But she was in her bitterness. And even despite that, because of Boaz, because of Ruth, there is this benefit of sorts to Naomi. In fact, the people around her are trying to get her to see this. Verse 14, the women said, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. And then, of course, in verse 17, this lineage, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. We come to this genealogy that reminds us of the Matthew genealogy that leads to Christ. Now, these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. You notice they left me that verse, by the way. Thanks, guys, for reading through those fun names. Note for those at home, you know how to pronounce these tough Bible names. There's a foolproof method. Say it with confidence. No one knows you're wrong, and if they do, let them know. But the rest of them will think you're great at that. So as you think about this, though, the important part are the names we do recognize. Verse 22, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. That's King David. That's Messianic King David. Now, Messianic King David, the one through whom would come the Savior, the Messiah, the great King David, who even though he was a great earthly king, we're really focused on that New Testament church age fulfillment, even if the Israelites didn't call it that. You think about David, and you think, that's God's people. That's the Israelite. That's the leader. That's great. That's true. He's also related to Ruth, the Moabite who lost her husband, the Moabite who, when Mr. No Name could have redeemed her, was like, no, that's way too much of an inconvenience. I'm either going to lose money. It's a lot of work. I don't want to support somebody who's not me, right? However you look at what he did, she's passed along. God says she is going to lead and be part of the family that leads to Christ. That's amazing. God thinks and works in ways that are so powerful we can't even fathom them. And so that's why Paul would write in Ephesians 3:20, he can do far more abundantly than all that we ask or think. That's our God. That's the God of Boaz. That's the God of Ruth. The question is, will I get out of the way and let him work his will through me and around me? Boaz did that. Ruth did that. And so you see Naomi benefiting in that way here. And so as you think about that, you start thinking about some bigger implications of this. Andrew, I'm going to pitch it to you in a moment as we go through kind of some Ruth final applications from the 4 chapters here. But one thing that has to stand out in chapters 1 through 4, before we get into more final application, is simply God doesn't see bloodlines. Is he aware that they're there? Yes. But here's Ruth in the lineage of Christ, in the lineage of King David. And so here's Naomi, this Israelite, who is the worst. Here's Mr. No Name, who is the worst. Yes, Boaz is good. Ruth is good. That's the key. God cares for those who show care for others, and most importantly, care for him. Going back to Ruth 1, who was it that Ruth gave glory to? She wanted to follow Jehovah. She wanted to go to be in the land of God. So I'm going to save some more for final application later there. Andrew, why don't you pop in here and finish up Ruth 4 and also some, what do you see in this whole book for some takeaways?
Yeah, so and I think you bring up a good point about this idea of bloodlines that we're seeing here, because the whole point of this story, we're introduced to Naomi is really, I think, in some capacities, the main character of this story, because she's the one who starts us off. And we think at first, okay, maybe it's going to be Elimelech, maybe it's going to be Mahlon and Chilion. Nope, they're dead right away. Naomi is the one who undergoes this dramatic transformation of character from Naomi to Mara, and now here, by the grace of God, she's Naomi once more. She's been filled up again. And all of this story has been about how is Elimelech's family going to be redeemed? How are they going to be taken care of? Chapter 2, Boaz takes care of him. Chapter 3, Naomi's like, well, maybe we need to find a way to get you married. And Boaz agrees to do that. And even in chapter 4, Boaz decides that, okay, I'm going to work with this other guy. He doesn't want to do it. I'm going to take on the responsibility. Elimelech's name will not be forgotten. He's going to have a child. Mahlon is going to have a child. So why then, in the final genealogy, is it not Mahlon, son of Elimelech, was born Obed? Because isn't that supposed to be his child? Isn't that even what Boaz himself said, that I'm going to raise this child in the name of Mahlon, in the name of Elimelech, by the name of the deceased, so they'll not be cut off. And yet, this concluding thought, this grand climax of the whole book, is not to Elimelech was born Mahlon, and to Mahlon born Obed, but to Salmon was born Boaz, and to Boaz Obed. And that's a really surprising twist, especially if you're reading this from the original Israelite viewpoint, is, wait, what happened to the redemption? What happened to this whole idea? And what seems to be going on is, I think a lot of what Greg was talking about is that Boaz and Ruth represent, I think, in many capacities, the people of God, both in the sense that Boaz, in contrast to Elimelech, in contrast to his family that fled from the promised land, that didn't have faith in God's promises, he stayed. He has been in Bethlehem. He has been in his city. He has been working for God's word. He has been righteous. He has been faithful. He is what Israel is supposed to be. He is what Israel looks like when they embody the Mosaic law. And Ruth is what happens when even the Gentiles, by the grace of God, by the influence of Israel, whatever can be said about Elimelech and Naomi, they must have done something to show Yahweh to Ruth. And in whatever capacity, we're not really told how, but Ruth knows Yahweh, and she loves Yahweh, even more so, it seems, than Naomi does, at least at the beginning of the book. She is faithful. And it's not about whether she's a Gentile or whether she's an Israelite. It's not about whether she's a Moabitess or a faithful daughter of Israel. It's that she's a faithful daughter of God. And so the end of the book, I think, affirms for us from God speaking through this author, is saying, this is where I will bring my promise. This lineage, not of faithless Israel, not just because of a bloodline, but those who are the faithful, those who are the righteous through my will, that is how my promises are going to be fulfilled. And so then we get Obed to Jesse to David, and all of those messianic promises therein contained, all of the promises of kingdom and restoration, not just for Israel, but for all the world. It's going to come through faithful Israel and faithful Gentile. And all of that comes together in this conclusion that essentially leaves the kind of unfaithful characters like Greg talked about. That means there's not a lot of mention of Naomi. There's not a lot of mention of Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion or Mr. No Name in this lineage. It's the faithful that are part of this lineage. And that, I think, speaks incredibly to us that it's not about our lineage. Now, most of us don't say, well, I'm Andrew, son of Eric, son of Al, son of these things. But do we talk about our spiritual lineage? Do we talk about our idea that, I've been a member of so-and-so church for 50 years, and my granddaddy was an elder, and my dad was this, and all these things. And so I know that I'm in a good situation. Do we place stock in our spiritual lineage and our spiritual understanding, or do we place stock in the faith that we have in the Lord? Do we take pride in being the sons and daughters of the Most High God? Because that's where our trust has to be placed, not in, are we attached to the right family group or the right church with the right name on the sign? Are we in a faithful relationship with the Lord? That's where our faith has to be placed rather than anything else. And so, Greg, Trey, as we're getting into these things, where are you seeing kind of the applications of the whole book here?
Yeah, I really appreciate how this book is working to show how God works through Gentiles, and how he's got concern for all the families of the earth. I mean, that has, we can sort of sometimes, I think, Israel, 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 we really get that driven to our heads, and rightly so. They were God's special people, God's chosen people. But really, from the opening pages of the Bible, God is concerned with humanity as a whole, and he always has been, he always will be. And so this is one of those stories that reminds us of that. It helps us to think that God cares for everybody, regardless of what your background is, where you come from. And so I think that's a really great application. And particularly thinking about the being part of the family of God, I think that was just really great. One of the things I see here, and this is more maybe of a lesser application, but I think important for us, is just remember what you have, realize what you have, be content with what God has given. Again, we mentioned this earlier at the beginning of the book, Naomi, she's lost everything. She's very aware that she's lost everything. And she says, I'm bitter, I'm empty. And that's when things start to go off the track, because she fails to realize what she does have. And I think that is so pertinent to really where we are this year, with everything that has been canceled, everything that we don't have, everything that we're not doing. And I don't know if I'm praying, but I'm certainly crossing my fingers, and there's a lot of wishful thinking going on about the college football season. But thinking about what we don't have versus what we do have, that's just the wrong lens to be looking through it. I mean, look at the very beginning of the Bible. Look at Genesis chapter 3. Where did things start to go wrong? Except when they failed to look at what God had blessed them with and start to look at what they couldn't have or what they didn't have. And so again, the end of this book, I think, serves as a reminder. Be thankful for what God has blessed us with. Realize what he's put in front of us. And oftentimes what he's put in front of us is so much more than what we could ever imagine, what we ever could think that it would be. And again, Ruth shows us that she's more to Naomi than 7 sons. And so that's at least my final takeaway from this chapter, and probably one from this book as well. But Gas, Andrew, I think you really hit it on the head with bringing in that family application, being the family of God. Greg, I'll throw it back to you to close us out and give your final application.
Sure. I think in the book of Ruth, one of the takeaways, aside from the big picture scriptural dives that Andrew's hit well and Trey has covered, is simply the character. Do I have the character of Boaz? Can I be a Boaz every day? The answer is yes. But what do I have to do? Well, unlike Mr. No Name, I have to be willing to do things that are difficult. I have to think about and do things that don't directly necessarily help me. They help others. I look at a world and I see all kinds of problems, and I see that people are doing this and doing that, and I don't like that, and I don't want to help them, I don't want to help that. But that's not the spirit. If God looked at us the way we sometimes look at others, Israel would have been wiped off the face of the planet years before. In fact, when you read, of course, the book of Exodus, they almost were, in the sense that they would have restarted through Moses, so God would have kept his promises in some senses. But as you look at what we are doing every day, we need God's blessings. We need God's grace and his mercy. And if that's true, why aren't we showing that to others? Boaz was a wonderful example of that. And how about when maybe we're not in the privileged position? What about when we're in the position that needs? Well, can I be a Ruth? Number one, do I trust that God will take care of me? Number two, do I know some of God's people that will help in carrying out God's plan to take care of me? But more specifically, what can I do when I'm in need? What did Ruth do? She clung to family. She stuck with God. She worked hard. She did whatever she could. She didn't sit back and bemoan the situation, at least that we have recorded much. She didn't sit back and just say, well, I'm not going to do that. Someone else is going to have to take care of us. She went to work, and she allowed God's machinations to work out to her benefit. God was watching out for her. Well, how and why? Apparently, because she got not only Boaz's attention, but the attention of God. For a Moabite woman to be in the lineage of Jesus Christ is astounding. There's no way around it. Ruth did something amazing. But to get to that amazing, which God did, the amazing part leading to Jesus, Ruth did the ordinary. She worked hard. She cared for others. She did the right thing. And so the question for me this day and all days is, will I do the right thing no matter what? Will I be a Boaz and look out to help others? Will I trust that God's plan works? But God's plan involves us doing what he says. God's plan is great. In the old law, Israelites were to look out for one another. They were even to look out for someone like Ruth in a particular special way. Boaz said, I will do what God commands. Other people didn't do that. People like Naomi found themselves complaining. Ruth worked. Boaz humbled himself and loved selflessly. And that created a situation through which God could be glorified and a relationship through which Jesus came. It's powerful. It's amazing. We need to take one day at a time, one step at a time, do the next right thing, and we can trust God to do the rest and do the miraculous. Andrew, thank you for having this study. I certainly appreciate it. Trey, I appreciate you joining us as well. And I'm thankful for this time to study the book of Ruth. Such a powerful story.
Absolutely. It's just, it is always encouraging to spend time with brothers, to study these things and to look at these things, especially to do these kind of good deep dives into it, to get the overall pictures, to look at the big pictures, but also to dive into the application. You know, what does this mean for us on a daily basis? How can we be more like Boaz? How can we be more like Ruth? How can we not be like Mr. No Name and forsaking our abilities? So thank you guys so much for joining us. Always a good study. Appreciate you guys' hard work in this. And hopefully we'll be able to tune in maybe in a little bit and get into another book and continue these types of studies. So thank you so much for those of you who have tuned in. We pray it has been beneficial to you, that it's been edifying to you in some way. And we encourage you, continue to look at these things, continue to study these things, and more importantly, continue to live these kind of things. May we all be blessed. May we all be more like God in our lives. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.